I think that changing our mind and our ideas about something is essential. And I don't think we should have any fear of failure or have any fear of experimentation. I think that's really important. So my artistic practice, I'm very interested in history and narrative. So growing up as a person from both an Indigenous and non-Indigenous family coming together, I grew up in Australia with very two conflicting ideas of history and also conquest and invasion. So Australia was invaded by the British. It was not a peaceful invasion, and in fact there are still many issues around racism, around access to healthcare, around visibility of our own rights, and I can see this kind of mirrored internationally. So even outside of Indigenous communities, even when we talk about this project, with the Skopje, I mean, it is about like the Baltic states and then the rest of Europe and the tensions within that as well. And so within my own arts practice, I'm very interested in kind of teasing out these narratives, not necessarily resolving them because I think it's too complex and too much of a burden, but I'm very interested in the kind of playful aspects of it, i.e. the kind of inflatable, the kind of alluring, kind of optical, kind of tricky kind of moments of that, and the gentle moments. But I'm also interested in other moments that are complex because they are complex. And I don't think everything can be resolved. So my arts practice looks at going into museum collections, sometimes working with cultural objects, anthropological objects, artists' work like this, and also public space in the body, and how we interact with these kind of narratives. I think that certain archival narratives like Walter Benjamin and others in kind of Western culture has its space, but from an Indigenous perspective, our narratives and our histories and our concept of time and place and space and objects is very different. So I'm very interested in that kind of space in between as well. So for me, it's more like a continual investigation and experimentation, and in some way similar to no feeling is final. In some way, this practice is not final. It's not ever finished. I think it's complex, and we change our minds and we have different ideas. So yeah, that's a bit about what my practice is. Apart from it also being very collaborative and very kind of grassroots, and I think that changing our mind and our ideas about something is essential. And I don't think we should have any fear of failure or have any fear of experimentation. I think that's really important. Yeah, so the Skopje collection was super exciting because it is such a disparate, kind of diverse collection of works, and because they are all selected by the artists themselves, it was really, I could imagine me doing something like that, going into my studio and thinking, oh, what would I want to give? And so because it's not a curated collection, like from a particular curator or something like this, it was for me kind of quite intimate as well, and unusual, and quite contrasting. But it also made it very exciting to kind of think, well, what kind of work could I select, or to kind of include into my installation. Well, all the artists are up here, and we can run through them. So Wilfredo Lam is one of my favorite painters from Cuba, and Picasso I have a kind of love-hate relationship with, but because this project was very much about solidarity as well, I mean, it was the artists themselves, giving these works. The selection really for me was looking at both the kind of problems of kind of, often Western male artists, being dominant in collections, but then I had to rethink that as a strategy for, well, what does this actually mean? Like, how do we actually rephrase this? So when I've worked with Picassos before, for example, in the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, I hung the Picasso on its side, and the Wilfredo Lam was hanging out from the wall, kind of looking down. So it's about kind of how I work with these artists to kind of bring out something different. So the difference between like the non, former Yugoslavian artists, for example, and the artists from former Yugoslavia are surrounded by the colors, and it was very difficult in a way to reduce the selection of artists. In fact, I was looking at other artists' work that I can see in other like contemporary artists here showing today. So in some ways, the selection of the artists, I feel like they're mirrored, like we're mirrored, everywhere. But one thing I felt very strongly is, the kind of absence of female artists, but also artists from kind of the greater world. But then again, of course, this was a different time. This is in the 60s, when the art world was actually very kind of closed off to a lot of the rest of the world. It was a very interesting process because, when you create a big sculpture like this, you can't really test it out. Like you just have to make drawings and, kind of see the juxtapositions in your imagination. But really knowing that the other artists, contemporary artists showing next to me using the collections, I knew there was a specific space. And so with my own practice, I am site specific. I do work with installation as well. And so the black and white pattern comes from gulani, or carved trees, and also shields, which is part of my mother's heritage, who's Aboriginal. She's Wiradjuri from Western New South Wales in Australia. And I use this kind of more abstract version, black and white pattern, as kind of almost like a hypnotic pattern as well. And for me, it's kind of like a matrix around narratives, or kind of how is it that we can look at other cultures or other narratives to kind of interweave with, in this case, the narrative of Skopje, but also Western painting, which is kind of quite prevalent in this. And so in some ways, the other artworks have become kind of consumed by my work, but then also highlighted. So in some ways, it's a collaboration with the deceased artist. Yeah, so I've been working with inflatables for maybe 15 years or something like this. But this is I wouldn't say it's the largest, but it's definitely the longest, flattest. And it kind of looks like a big bed. But the whole idea is really, like I was saying about the pattern being hypnotic, or kind of like an optical illusion. The whole idea is for people to lay down and to look up at the artworks and to see a view of history differently, to see a view of solidarity differently, to change the way in which our body is. So I'm very interested in the positioning of body and power, and who has power and who doesn't have power, which is often through body language. And so if all of us can lay down together and be more equal, and then to look up. Well, I was confused about the title at first, because in some ways it's a loop. Like it doesn't finish. And in fact, this is exactly what Sabina talks about. It's like, well, the feeling doesn't really finish. And so I find this really poetic. I write poetry myself and prose, and I don't think that life is ever finished. I think that memory and our relationships to each other is never really resolved. Even if we say we don't want to have a relationship or a friendship or whatever any kind of relationality to an object or a thing is, we still have a memory of it. It's evoked through smell or through kind of light or experiences. So I think it's a really important kind of compassionate way to continue visibility of histories. And I was asked to do the artist commission for this show, and so it's a scarf with my pattern, and it has "No feeling is final" on it. So I kind of think, well, this is going to touch the body and keep us warm. So I don't know, it has lots of different applications. Yeah.